Now, you people look funny. Not so bad. Isaiah's my name. Preaching's my game. Sometimes I prophesy too. I'm not the first preacher to become a prophet, nor am I the first to be called Isaiah. I don't expect to be the last of either. I just am what I am, what God called me to be. Now, the first Isaiah, the one our book is named for, lived almost 200 years ago before me. Back in the days we know about only from stories passed down by the elders, by scrolls written by the scribes, by the written words of prophets past, kept safe by prophets present. Now, the old stories and the old scrolls and the old prophets don't always agree with one another, but they have one thing in common. They make it clear that we people of Israel were not what we used to be when I was around. We like to remember ourselves as a nation strong and free, a power on earth, a people of some wealth and much opportunity. We liked to think that other nations admired us for our clear set of laws, for our faith in God that joined us together, and for that amazing God we served who had made us great. We used to be. That was before it started falling apart. Too many people began to follow too strongly in their own ways. The wealthy folks began to ignore both the law and the faith in order to become more wealthy, even when their greed made life much harder for those who were poor. Then those who were exploited felt let down by God for letting this happen. People of every stripe began to behave more and more like our pagan neighbors. Now, the first Isaiah we call Isaiah of Jerusalem because, well, that's where he lived. And he was called by God to tell the truth, whether people wanted to hear it or not. That's what a prophet does. That's a preacher's job. Isaiah looked about him and he saw what the people were doing. He looked inside himself and he sensed what God wanted the people to do. He looked into the holy writings and he understood the covenant God had made with the people, and what Isaiah saw spelled trouble. The people had not kept their part of the covenant. They were sinning against God and against each other and against themselves. They had lost their fear of God, lost their focus for living, lost their future in the land. The first Isaiah, preaching to the people of Jerusalem, said something that ought to have been obvious to all of them. He said, "Look how this faithful city has become a harlot. She once was full of justice and righteousness used to dwell in her, but now murderers. Your silver has become dross. Your choice wine is diluted with water. Your rulers are rebels, companions of thieves. They all love bribes and chase after gifts. They do not defend the cause of the fatherless or hear the case of the widow. And therefore the Lord, Yahweh Almighty, the Mighty One of Israel, declares, I'll get relief from my foes and avenge myself on my enemies. I will turn myself against you. I will purge away your dross and remove your impurities. I will restore your judges as in days of old and counselors as at the beginning, and then you'll be called a city of righteousness, the faithful city. Well, that first Isaiah went on to predict, and you could see some of it in those words, that the kingdom up in the north, the one we call Israel, that we consider down in the south, we consider them worse than us. He predicted that the war-loving Assyrians would soon become the instrument of God's judgment on them, and he was right. And he also suggested that if Judah, we people down in the south, if we didn't get our act together, that we'd be in trouble too. And he was right. It took 125 years, but here we are, there we were, beaten by the Babylonians, mucking around between the Tigris and the Euphrates, far from the banks of the Jordan, far, far from home. Now, King Nebuchadnezzar, the one that beat us, he was strong and he was mean, but at least he was sane. Now, I was born in Babylon, and by the time I came of age, we were living under this crazy king named Nabonidus. Even people who didn't care anything about politics knew something was wrong with him. His primary worship was to the moon god Sin instead of the storm god Marduk, even though Marduk was a national god. He spent all his time at his vacation home down in Tema. He wouldn't come back to the capital even for the most sacred of the Babylonian holy days, not even for the Akitu festival at the New Year. And you couldn't do the ceremonies there without the king. He sent a substitute. Anyone with an ear to the ground knew that with a king like Nabonidus, Babylon was in trouble. Knew that King Cyrus of Persia had conquered the Medes and set his eyes on a larger empire. It looked as if we might soon have another king, maybe another 50 years in exile. Who knew? It was a miserable time. We were a pitiful people. We've been in bondage for more than a generation. It was a dark day. And it was a dark night, too, when the Lord first came to me. Called me to prophesy in his name. It felt incredibly strange. Strange that God would speak to me. But he called me and he gave me a mission to accomplish and a message to proclaim and a vision for the future. I was sleeping, or at least I thought I was. Maybe I was dreaming, maybe not. But in any case, it was the Lord's voice. I'm certain of that. And this is what he said. Go tell my people. Comfort my people. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem. Proclaim to her that her hard service has been completed, that her sin has been paid for, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. I heard the voice call again, and God said, in the desert, prepare the way for the Lord. Make straight in the wilderness a highway for God. Every valley shall be raised up, and every mountain and hill made low, and the rough ground shall be made level, and the rugged places a plain. And the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all humankind will see it, for the mouth of the Lord is spoken. And the voice said, cry out. And I said, what shall I cry? And God said, all people are like grass. All their glory is like the flowers of the field. And the grass withers and the flowers fall when the breath of the Lord blows on them. Surely these people are grass. And the grass withers and the flowers fall. But the promises of God stand forever. Now, I have to tell you, this was hard for me to hear. It was strange. It was harder to believe. Could it be true that God had not forgotten us? Could it be true that God had made a promise that we'd be free? Could it be true that God had called me to proclaim that message? Now, I'd studied the writings of old Isaiah of Jerusalem for many years. I admired the prophets, but I never thought the Lord would call on me to take up the mantle and prophesy in His name. I felt at the same time both strong and frightened, both confident and anxious, both ready to preach and ready to hide. But the Lord would not let me hide. I tell you this, when the Lord gives you a message, you cannot keep it for yourselves. God will put a fire in your bones until you get out and get it out. God will put a tickle on your tongue and nothing will scratch it other than proclaiming the word that has been put there. And so I began to preach God's message of comfort and of hope. And a strange thing occurred to me. It was hard to accept, but I came to believe that the Lord was in it. We all knew Cyrus was coming. Could Cyrus be the instrument of God's deliverance? Would God use a pagan king to redeem His people? I didn't like the idea. I wanted a great Israelite king to rise up and lead us to victory. But there weren't even any poor Israelite kings around. The Lord had used a pagan king to judge Israel. Could God not also use a pagan king to deliver His people as well? Well, the more I thought about it, the better sense it made. And I began to preach that Cyrus was God's anointed redeemer coming to set God's people free. Those people laughed at me at first, but soon it became clear that I was right, that the Lord was right. For Cyrus did not only conquer Babylon, but one of his very first acts was to make a decree that we could be free. He even promised a military escort and financial support for Hebrews who wanted to go back home to Jerusalem. You think anybody was happy about that? Oh, there was quite a celebration, especially among the old folks. Many people were ecstatic, and I was beside myself for a while. What amazing news, but I'm a selfish guy like most anybody else, and I became a bit melancholy, for I assumed my primary mission in life must have been over. I had prophesied the deliverance of Israel from the clutches of Babylon, and the Lord had used my preaching to bring hope to the people. Now their freedom seemed to be on the horizon. And I thought, well, my career as a prophet's probably gone over the horizon too. The Lord probably doesn't need me anymore. And I spent a lot of time out walking in the fields, out beyond the barley plantations that were irrigated, out on the edge of the desert. There was something about it that fascinated me, especially those old wind-bitten trees that looked like skeletons. Maybe it was because they reminded me that the present age of suffering was about to pass. Maybe because it reminded me a new age was coming, or maybe because they made me feel my career was passing too. And I just sort of resigned myself to the idea that God probably wouldn't be speaking to me again. But I was wrong. Oh, I was dead wrong. The Lord did in fact speak to me again. And at first I was overjoyed that God was still speaking, but then I was really confused by what I heard. I was walking along that desert's edge one day, step by dusty step, and I tripped over an old root sticking out of the ground. It hurt too. I was bleeding. Sandals don't offer much protection when you bust your toe against something. I sat down on a stump to nurse my toe and cursed the root when a thought occurred to me. A root out of dry ground. That was all at first. Just that simple phrase, it stuck in my head like a little tune and it wouldn't go away. A root out of dry ground. And then I looked around and I noticed that one of those roots sticking up not far from me had sprouted and grown, and it was well on its way to becoming a tree. Now, it was not a pretty tree, don't get me wrong. It was ugly, misshapen. It was nothing to commend it except that it had managed to survive in the midst of those desert winds. I was saddened by the knowledge that this brave tree from a dry root might one day be cut down for somebody's firewood. And there it was, another thought, a new thought, a thought that had to be from God. There was something more that people needed to hear. God's plan was bigger than Cyrus, bigger than Israel, bigger than a simple return to the promised land. There's a bondage that goes deeper than handcuffs or shackles or being forced to live away from home. There is a prison of the soul, and our problem through the years had been our inability to overcome that sinful nature that had imprisoned us. And there it was, a root out of dry ground, a twisted tree standing strong in the wind, a tree cut down for the sake of people, a faithful servant of God who would overcome adversity and sacrifice himself to redeem God's people from their sin. And as quickly as the message came to me, I realized that nobody would believe it. But God would not let me keep it in. And so I began to proclaim to everybody who would listen that God had more in store. Look, I said, my servant, God's servant, will act wisely. He'll be raised and lifted up and highly exalted, just as there were many who were appalled at him, for his appearance was disfigured beyond that of any man, his form marred beyond human likeness. He will startle many nations. Kings will shut their mouths because of him. But what they were not told, they will see. And what they've not heard, they will understand. What in the world could cause a king to shut his mouth? What could silence a politician? Nothing but a vision of power that has its roots in suffering and not in glory. They will have nothing to say because what they will see is beyond their imagination or their ability to describe. Who can believe it? I began to preach about something that was yet to come, but yet I was so certain of it that God led me to speak as if it had already happened. Who has believed our message? To whom has the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a tender shoot and like a root out of dry ground. And yet it was the Lord's will to crush him, to cause him to suffer. And though the Lord made his life a guilt offering, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After the suffering of his soul, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many. He will bear their iniquities. Therefore I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death, and he was numbered with the transgressors, for he bore the sins of many and made intercession for their transgression. Here was not only a new thing, but an incredible thing. There's something greater than justice. There is love. There's grace. I must tell you, this was not a popular message when I began to proclaim it, because nobody could begin to understand it. People were not ready for such a message, even though God had given it to them. It was only many years later, after the servant had come and lived and taught and healed and suffered and died and rose again, only then did they begin to put my words, God's word, with his life. And the one you call Paul said, "But God proves his love for us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us." Now, I don't know what keeps you people in bondage. I don't know what sins easily beset you, but I do know the servant has come. Like a root out of dry ground, he grew up. Like a bent tree in the desert, he suffered. Like a tree needed for a greater purpose, he was cut down. And he did that for all of us. Just as that stump sprouted and broke out into new life, just so he can give you new life. He lived and died to take away your iniquities, to cleanse your transgressions, to forgive your sins. He wants you to believe him. He wants you to be free today. He wants you to proclaim the message of forgiveness and life to others. He wants you to love even as he loves, even when it hurts. Who has believed our report? I hope you have. This morning, if anything Isaiah has shared with us speaks to your heart and might be leading you to think about some decision you need to make, to trust this Christ as your Savior, to become a member of this family where you can grow and be strong and be a witness and make a difference for others. Or whether it's just to come and pray about something in your life or recommit your life to serving God, we invite you to do that as we stand together now and sing